All right, people, look who it is. It's Lilly Dancyger, author of First Love. Came out in May. Lilly, How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Glad to have you on. You are part of a growing tribe of writers I'm most interested in, mostly because I'm doing the same thing myself right now, which
Mm.
is sort of the connected series of essays as memoir, which First Love is. Would you describe it? I mean, it's an essay collection, but it has a little more focus than that. Is that fair?
Yeah. I enjoy the kind of murky space between essay collection and memoir. I would say it's more toward the collection side, but there is kind of a continuous story. The essays are very much in conversation with each other.
Yeah.
I couldn't get away from wanting to build an arc in there somewhere.
Yeah, I had to try to resist that. I mean, an arc exists, but one of the beauties of the collection is you can really enjoy the small piece, like a poetry collection almost, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The distinct units, each essay gets to play by its own rules
Yeah.
and all that.
You can even experiment with form a little bit if you feel like it.
Totally. Yeah,
All right.
finding
So
some variety. Oh,
what's
sorry, go
that?
ahead. Yeah, just finding variety in form, I think was one of the most fun parts for me.
I agree. It just frees us up a little bit. And so, okay, so First Love, this is the collection that came out in May. You had a memoir before that called Negative Space, and then you Burn It Down, which was a collection of women writing about anger. You edited, or you were
Correct.
the, okay.
Yeah.
All right,
Hmm.
well, let's back up a little bit. It's so one of the nice things about reading a person's memoir-ish stuff is you then learn about them. So I know childhood, not easy, but that's the stuff of good memoir, good storytelling.
Yes.
But I mean, really not easy, it sounds like for you. Um, but and it doesn't sound like based on like, yeah, you probably left some stuff out, but were you doing much creative work when you were a girl, or were you mostly just screwing around? Or were you actually trying to focus a little bit?
Um, a little of both, both my parents were creative people, and my father in particular was a sculptor, and an artist of many mediums. And so the idea of the creative drive as just an undercurrent of human life was instilled in me from a very young age. My father was always drawing something or sculpting something or picking up a piece of trash off the street to use in a sculpture. And most of the games we played together were actually making art,
Yeah.
disguised
Oh,
as playing
okay.
a game.
Right.
Um, so that was just, part of the world and part of being alive for me from a young
Yeah.
age. And as a teenager, I did a lot of screwing around. But I also was always drawing and dancing and writing.
You were
Um,
writing?
yeah,
What kind of stuff?
um, well, I kept a pretty extensive diary. I was a big Anais Nin
Oh.
fan,
Oh, okay. Okay.
as you have learned from First Love. And some bad angsty teenage poetry and some bad heavy-handed short stories,
Okay. Yeah. So
all
you
kinds of
were
stuff. Yeah.
experimenting and you were a reader also.
Yeah,
Uh,
reading a lot. I dropped out of high school and decided that that would be fine as long as I read a lot. And at the end of the day, I think that turned out to be true. So,
yeah, it's interesting with high school. For some reason, the thing I'm working on now, I've gone back to writing about it a lot for
mm,
my own surprise, but not what I was learning. Because I just think that in high school, I don't know. I think most of what I learned from reading. Because I was a pretty voracious reader, and I think most of it came from the reading I did, or the playing Dungeons and Dragons, or writing. Like all
mhm.
the kind of stuff I was just
Yeah,
doing is where I learned the most. I learned something maybe in the classes, but
yeah, not a whole
I
lot.
don't
Yeah, I
think a
mean, most
lot.
of what
Not
you're supposed to learn in that period of your life is like how to be a person, right?
It's really
Which you
true.
don't
Yeah.
need to be in school for. So,
And so you go to college, and that's where you kind of like hunker down a little bit and enjoy the regimen. And did you have your sights set on what did you have your sights set on when you went? Just not being on the street? Like what was the
Yeah, I decided it was time for a change of pace, you know. I dropped out of high school in ninth grade, so I had been out of
Yeah,
school for 4 years by the time I went to
it's
college.
crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, it not to you, I know, but it's an unusual that here you are with your feet on the
I
ground,
know. Yeah, I
given
think
that
most
biography.
people, even most people who drop out of high school, I think stick it out for a couple of years. But I just knew I went to literally a couple months of high school and I just knew I wasn't going to make it to the end. I hated it so much. So it's like,
Yeah,
oh, I might as well cut my losses and
yeah,
quit now.
yeah,
But then I got kind of bored, you know, it was 4 years of doing whatever, getting
yeah,
into trouble, drinking a lot, partying, etc. And also working, you know, I got my first job waiting tables when I was 14. Um,
You
and there
found a
was just
place that would let you wait tables when you were 14? That's against
I
the
did,
law.
yeah, it is totally against the law, but it was this tiny little restaurant on Ludlow Street where I lived. It was downstairs from us, and the owner was just this totally goofy, sweet stoner guy who just thought it was funny that I wanted a job, I think.
All right.
And so it's like, sure, you know,
Yep.
whatever. You can work off the books, wait tables a couple days a week.
Nice. All
And
right.
that
So you
was
did
my
a little
first
growing
job.
up. And so you go off to school and and what was that like now being introduced into like back into like the regular world, such
It
as it
was an
is?
adjustment for sure. But I liked, you know, by then I was excited to learn in a more structured way, other than just picking up books about things that were interesting to me, you know,
Yeah.
and I was lucky to have some really great professors. Um, I definitely noticed some gaps in my, you know, in my education. Um, but I also noticed pretty quickly that everybody had those. You know,
Yeah.
at first
Yeah.
I felt self-conscious about it, like, oh, everybody knows all this foundational stuff that I don't know. But that turned out not to be true, right? Like there was plenty of stuff that I knew that other people didn't, and
Yeah.
you know, and then stuff that I had to catch up on. But I was ready at that point to kind of buckle down and be studious.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, the thing is, you're a writer, so this is what you do. And the thing about writing, and I tell the story, but it's true. So I went to college. I'm a freshman in college, and because my SAT score was 10 points too low, I had to take this basic composition
Mm.
class,
Hmm.
which insulted me to no end because I already knew I wanted to be a writer. Like this was the
Yeah.
only thing I wanted to do, and all this. And the professor was like, "Oh, you know how to write." And I was like, "Yeah, I shouldn't have to take this class." And he said, "Well, you can maybe you'll skip this part two, you know, if I show your piece to the head of the English department." And so they did, and I was called into her office, and she asked me a serious question, and I gave her a serious answer, but I didn't understand the question. She said, "Where did you learn to write?" And I said,
Mm.
"At my typewriter." Now it sounds snarky, but like I couldn't. I was like, "Well, I sat at my typewriter."
Yeah.
And I mentioned it because writing, you can take MFA and blah blah blah, but the the nothing, you just got to do it and do it
Yeah,
and do it. Like there's nothing's going to replace that ever.
for
All the
sure.
schooling in the world's not going to replace that.
Yeah, I learned how to write by writing my first book. You know,
Yeah.
the memoir took 12 years to write
Oh,
because
oh, oh,
yeah,
oh.
because I had to learn what I
you
was
you
doing.
aren't that old, my dear. You must have started when you were 12. No.
I started it in college actually. It was the
Oh,
first
okay.
draft of it was my undergraduate thesis.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I graduated college and thought I was going to publish it, thought I had
Sure.
written a book.
Sure.
And then realized that I had barely written the first draft of a book, you know, and I
Right.
had to.
No, but so I haven't read the memoir. I
Mhm.
haven't read the natives, but were you covering your childhood essentially? Because
Um,
it seems as I was reading this book and you dip in, I was like, well, that's a childhood that could have a book, could probably hold them.
yeah. Yeah, it's mostly, well, so Negative Space is about my father, and he
Ah,
died when I
okay.
was 12. So
I see.
there's kind of his life story up until then, and then also some of my teenage life
Oh,
and
you
the
wrote
years
about
after.
Oh,
Yeah.
you did the thing. That's tricky to do in memoir. I think of Fuller, Alexandra Fuller. She's done it some writing about her mom a lot, who's a
Mm.
character. But usually it's tough to get into other people's lives. But you let yourself write about him a little bit.
Yeah, I actually that first draft that I thought was finished and that I was going to publish was an artist monograph. It wasn't even a memoir originally. It was
Right.
like a
Okay.
biography of him. The the very first draft I actually refer to his daughter Lily. And
Oh,
my
you were like a scholar who had discovered him.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, I was writing about it. He was a really amazing artist, and he didn't get the he didn't get public recognition while he was alive.
Right.
And so the original impetus of the project was like, I'm going to make a book about his
Oh,
art, and I'm
oh,
going to put
nice.
his art into a book where other people can see it. So that was what the story was, But then for several drafts over the course of several years, every time anybody read it, they were like, okay, but what was it like to live in this world as a kid? Going to
Right.
these village galleries and having parents who were addicted to heroin and this kind of outsider world. Um, so I kind of sprinkled more and more of myself into it until it eventually begrudgingly became a memoir, but that took 12 years.
So, oh wow. So that was the journey. And so you you had to learn because I wrote fiction for years. I didn't have any success with it, but I learned how to write. And then it was when I switched over
Mhm.
to memoir stuff that I started having success. But I had to learn how to write memoir. A lot of what I learned from fiction, totally applicable. Obviously, some aspects, so not so much. But I did have to
Right.
learn how to do it. It's a different animal. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and so you had to learn not just how to write a book, but how to write that kind of book, how to where you're in it, which is
Yes.
has its own traps. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I was resistant to it. I think I didn't want to write a dead daddy book. I didn't want it to be saccharine or self-pitying or whatever.
Right.
Which I guess was my own prejudice against memoir at the beginning. But then I had to learn, I had to learn over time that you can write about difficult experiences without it being self-pitying, and you can
Of-
write about grief without it being, oh, woe is me. It took
Absolutely.
time.
When I have
So,
students who are writing memoir or they think they want to write memoir, they say, "Well, I don't want to write about me," and I'm like,
mhm.
"Good, you're not going to write about. It's not
Yeah,
about you."
exactly.
Ultimately,
Yeah.
hopefully, obviously you're in it, but it can never, if I'm reading your pieces, I have to feel Bill has to be able to feel myself in it, I think, for it to, you
Yeah.
want to be able to transcend just your little narrow slice of life.
Yeah.
So you had to learn that. And so, but did you, as 12 years, that's like a big, like that's, hunkering down and you're probably just doing stuff in the meantime.
Yeah.
Um, but you must have liked it on some, as difficult as it was. Did you like just having something to sink your teeth into every day or?
I did. I did for some of the time. I mean, 12 years is
Yeah.
long enough to go through
Yeah.
many cycles of loving it and hating it and, and wanting to give up and all of that. But I think because of the subject matter that I chose, and because I was doing it not only for myself, but for my father and his legacy and trying to tell his story and all of that I didn't feel like I could walk away.
All
It was
right.
something that I felt like I had to do. Um, which was, there were times where I was like, why did I pick this for my first book? I felt so much pressure.
Yeah.
But it's good, I think, that I chose something that I didn't feel able to abandon. Because even when it was hard and even when I knew that I had kind of reached the limit of my own ability, um, and it was tempting to walk away, I instead did the alternative, which is, okay, well, I guess I have to get better. I guess I have to learn how to
Right.
do whatever this next thing is that this book is demanding.
Right. And what was the big, I mean, it sounded like you learned a ton, but when you think about that first book, like what were the like one or two big things that like really became clear to you in terms of how to
Mm.
write a book or how to write memoir? Like what really, cause I know I have my things that I had to like get and the other things that came naturally.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing that is particular that I really had to internalize, something that I think was the biggest or one of the biggest transformations in my personal approach to writing was kind of what we were just talking about of learning to put emotion on the page
Oh,
and not
you're such an
feel
emotional person, aren't you? You're not so
well,
stoic.
but my early drafts really were. I
Yeah, because
really
you're a smarty too. So you wanted to lead
yeah,
with your brain maybe a little bit.
exactly. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
very intellectualized and
Right.
very like I don't, I was leaving a lot of that work to the reader to be like, okay, well,
Ah,
I've just shown you a scene of, me at 8 years old in a methadone clinic waiting room. Do I really need to tell you that that's fucked up?
yes, you do.
But but
Yep.
then it's like, well, yes, it
Yep.
is not actually enough to just put the
Yep.
scene in there, no matter how
Seems obvious, but
whatever.
yeah.
And that was something that for some reason I really had to, it took me a long time to get there because I always felt like just showing the thing was enough
Right.
and that I shouldn't have to spell out how I feel
Right.
about the thing.
But you don't want to spell it out too much.
Exactly,
And so you're
exactly.
always wrestling with that.
Yeah,
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah. But
All
that's
right.
something I eventually learned to kind of calibrate. And I
Yeah.
still have that tendency, but now I know, now I recognize it, now I
Yeah.
know that like, okay, this feels like it's clear to me, which means it's probably not enough and I should
Right.
add a little more.
Oh, that's see, these are I had to really learn with memoir, and it's obvious now, but to lean on scene, like find scenes,
Mm.
don't just talk about it, Bill. Like
Yeah, yeah,
find
yeah,
a thing that
yeah.
happened.
Specific
And
moments.
yeah,
Yeah.
I just don't because I think our minds don't always think in specific moments. So all right, so but I assume, well, I don't know, maybe, but I assume you were maybe writing because First Love is a collection of essays about friendship, but I'm wondering if were you starting to publish? You've been published in a lot of good places. Um,
Mhm.
were you writing other stuff in the meantime and sending them off? How was that? Was that
Yeah, yeah,
happening?
definitely. I studied journalism. So that was, I was working as a
Ah,
freelance
okay.
journalist and doing a lot of like commentary, cultural criticism stuff.
Oh,
Um,
oh, you were straightening us out, huh?
yeah, I tried. But yeah, so I was kind of building that portfolio
Aside, yeah,
for several years while writing Negative Space. And I actually eventually stopped doing that work because of Negative Space, because um, when I was switching back and forth between writing these 800 word hot takes for the internet and then trying to
right.
revise like a literary memoir, switching between those two voices, which are so, so different, was really challenging. And I
I
found it hard to get out of that cadence.
totally get it. Totally to get out of the hot take cadence, which
Yes,
because you're
yeah.
doing those quicker, you're probably and you can. It's probably easier, honestly, in certain
Oh yeah,
ways.
much easier. Much
Yeah,
easier, but it's such a specific, yeah, it's such a specific voice and it's such a specific kind of um brevity, and it's very quippy and very succinct.
yeah,
And I was trying to, like we're talking about, trying to sink deeper and
yeah.
trying to stretch out scenes and trying to spend more time imbuing the story with emotion and with imagery and with meaning. And it was too hard to switch back and
Yeah,
forth
no,
between the two modes.
I totally get it. I totally get it because I know that because I've written some books that are in the sort of personal growth sort of world, and I'm comfortable in that. I'm a bit of a teacher. I like it. But I can't. That voice, as good as it is, natural as it is for me, it's inspiring. I like to inspire people. Once I really sink into story, that voice cannot enter into.
Hmm.
It's too.
Hmm.
I'm too present in that way, and just doesn't work. All right, but like I said, this is a collection of essays. So this is always the question: had you simply published a few and said, "Hey, these seem to be similar," or did you say, "I want to write about friendship"? Okay, how did you come up with this format, this subject?
Yeah. I came up with the idea
Ah,
rather
okay,
than like collecting existing essays. And it actually grew out of the memoir because as I was adding more and more of my own experience and, writing about the years immediately after my father's death, which was when, my mom and I moved back home to New York City. I dropped out of high school. I made these friends that became, my second family.
yep,
But there just was not room to go in depth to all those relationships in
right,
the memoir because that's not what it was about.
right.
But once I dipped a toe in that pool, I was like, oh, there's so much here. There's,
Isn't
there's
that
so much I
isn't it
want to talk
interesting when you
about.
can feel? Isn't it interesting when you're surprised? I've done that where I've started something and I go, "Oh, I thought I was just going to write about X, but wow, Y." When I've
Yeah.
opened Y up, it just is ready to go.
Yeah. So I told myself, I was like, you can write about this later, keep it
Right.
moving, keep focused on the story you're trying to tell. Um, and that's when that idea first planted in my head that I wanted to write more about those relationships, which were so, so meaningful to me and really have saved my life in some difficult years. Um, and, I started thinking about how friendships don't get the love story treatment usually, they're
Nope, not unless they turn sexual,
exactly, yeah.
not
But
unless
like,
they,
but they don't get, you don't, there are not that many stories that really are about a friendship, right? Friends exist in the periphery of other stories. They're supporting characters. They
yeah,
might, pop in to have an illuminating conversation that makes the narrator realize something, right?
yep,
But
yep,
that relationship and its trajectory and its nuances and all of that is just not usually the focus. But thinking about all these relationships in my life that are so impactful and so important to me, it's like I
yeah.
want to write about them like love stories.
But it is true about, and you do it beautifully, by the way. Really good job.
Thanks.
But
Thanks.
it's really true about friendships, particularly when you're single. I mean, it's true when you pair up, but if you haven't paired up in a meaningful way, friends replace your family. I mean, who else is there? And as my wife pointed out to me how um, women's friendships can become even more intimate sometimes.
Hmm.
There's sort
Hmm.
of a natural tendency that way.
Yeah, there's, I think, less, I don't know, less barrier to being vulnerable with each
Hmm.
other.
Yeah, I think so too. I
Yeah.
think so too. And so you said, all right, I'm gonna, and so did you just say, okay, I'll just start picking friends. I'll say I'm going to write about that one because that's kind of how I do it when I do my collections. Like, oh, there's that story, and there's that story, and there's that story. How did you go about picking what to focus on?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. I mean, so once I knew I wanted to write about friendship, um, I also at the same time was beginning to write about my cousin Sabina, who was murdered when she was 20 and I was 21, and trying to find my way into that story.
Hmm.
And I at first was thinking of these as kind of two separate projects or two separate
Right.
concerns. But in writing about Sabina, I really didn't want to write, I didn't want to focus on murder. I didn't want that to be the story, you
And
know?
you really have to. It's tough to do
It's
because
really hard not to,
well,
yeah, to
because
write
the
about
reader's like, well,
someone.
what happened?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's so natural.
Yeah. And that's also why I didn't talk about her murder at all in negative space, even though the story spans the period of time when that happened.
Right.
Because I tried a few times, but there's no way you can't just drop a murder into the middle of
No,
a story and then
no,
just keep moving and have
no,
that not be the focus,
no.
you know?
That's right. That's
It
right.
would have just taken over.
Right.
So that was another thing that I was like, okay, you can write about that later, you know? And then
Right.
when I put both of those subjects aside, they kind of cross-pollinated and became one thing. And I
Right.
realized that the way to write about Sabina without writing about murder was to write about love and to write
Right.
about our relationship, which was kind of the formative template for close female friendships in my life. And so the title of the collection, First Love, comes from the first essay in the book
Yeah.
that's about Sabina,
Yeah.
and us growing up together and our closeness. So I kind of, from the beginning, that was the framework of like, okay,
And
I'm
you
going to
knew it
write
was going to
about,
be essays. You knew it was going to be short pieces, not one big story.
yes, yes. Partly because the narrative structure of Negative Space was the hardest part to figure out, and I was like,
I,
I need to do something else.
I totally agree. Sometimes it feels
Yeah,
so artificial,
yeah,
like
yeah.
life doesn't quite work that way. But
It doesn't.
you
Yeah,
know,
in a neat kind of
yeah,
progression. But also partly because one of the things that was compelling to me about the subject matter was the way that each close friendship is kind of its own world.
right,
So just like we were talking about at the beginning of, each essay is its own thing and plays by its own rules and has its own kind of form and conceit, and even sometimes the voice is a little different. I liked that idea of having them be distinct in that
yeah.
way to kind of replicate the feeling of that like prismatic identity that's formed through relationships.
Obviously, it took you less time to write,
It did, yes. Yeah.
but was it? I mean, I'm sure there were challenging parts, but was it easier in certain ways because you had grown so much as a writer?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, easy is a relative,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah. It
know.
wasn't easy. It was, I had to, there's a lot that I had to learn in order to write this book in, in the same way that I had to learn to write the first one. But there also is a lot that I learned in the first one that carried over,
But didn't you
and I
have
think
to
maybe
learn how to end them? Like,
and the essays,
isn't that a
yeah, yeah,
thing?
yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah,
the memoir has one ending,
yeah.
and big stories can end differently. Like, they can have a nice denouement to it, but the short pieces kind of gotta,
Yeah,
you
they have to stick the landing.
yeah.
Endings are hard. Endings are always hard for
I
sure.
think I think they're the most important part of the story. I'm evangelical about it now. No, it's serious. Like, I think it's difference
Yeah.
between an okay essay and a really good one is where do you land? Where do you end it?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I
Yeah,
agree with that.
and because you've got to kind of make a decision. Like, now, why was I telling this?
Right.
Right? Isn't that kind of where you come to
Have
some
I
conclusion?
arrived anywhere? Do I
Right.
actually know what I'm talking about?
Right.
Is there a point to this at
Yeah, you
all?
can't just
Yes.
say, so that happened.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
like there
Yeah.
has to be some sort of point, that
Yeah.
and so I saw you as because part of me is I read as a reader and I read as a writer. And I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, how's she going to do this one? Oh, that was good. Okay. Oh, that was interesting. Well done. I
Thank
don't, do
you.
you do
Yeah.
that now that you've written a couple of these things when you start reading other writers who are doing similar stuff? Do you find yourself
Oh yeah.
observing what they're doing?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes
How
I
is
try and
that
turn it
for
off,
you?
but I can't.
You try to turn it
I mean,
off?
I like it. I enjoy seeing other writers' minds working on the
Yeah.
page, and I'm always kind of making notes of like, oh, that was a cool move. Or,
Yep. Yep.
yeah,
Yeah, it actually, I think there's a way to do it without ever being derivative. You're just saying, "Oh, that's a way of handling it. That's
exactly.
good." It
Yeah.
can be very inspiring. And so, see, I know I was just watching John Baptiste. You familiar with John Baptiste, the
Mm-mm.
pianist? He'd been Stephen Colbert's band leader essentially, but he's
Oh,
a very
okay.
famous jazz pianist, kind of a prodigy guy. Just hearing a Green Day song for the first time, and as he's hearing it, composing over it,
Hmm.
but talking about like, oh, they're doing that. Oh, I see what you're doing. Oh, look what you're doing here. All right, I got you. I see what. Very funny little thing, but it. I'm not saying I'm a prodigy, but it reminded me how I think when I see writers doing certain things and admiring it or disapproving sometimes. I have to admit, sometimes.
Oh yeah, I think seeing writers do things that you don't like is just as instructive. Sometimes being like, oh, that's
Yes,
so annoying. I don't ever want to do
yes, I
that.
totally agree. Because if it's annoying you, you don't want to do that. That's your aesthetic saying, nah, 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 nah,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, that's how you kind of find the boundaries of what you want to do. Yeah.
So you're talking to me, which is I'm so glad for. But this was published in May, so you probably had a time after it was published where you got to talk to readers or whoever. How's the
Mhm.
conversation been around this book for you?
It's been really great, honestly. I mean, with negative space, a lot of the reader response came from people who have lost a parent or
Right, right,
who have loved someone who was an addict. And, I was, of course, grateful to have provided something that was meaningful to people
right.
experiencing things like that. But a lot of those conversations were pretty heavy.
Sure.
And with this one, a lot of people are telling me about their best friends, which is just so much more
Shocking.
fun to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I got to do a tour, which was really
Oh
fun.
yeah.
And at so many events, there were like pairs or small groups of young
Right,
women who had like come to
right.
the event together as a
Yeah.
friendship date, and it was really, really lovely and sweet.
And do you like when you did events? Did you read?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Usually like a little short reading and then a conversation
Yeah.
with a moderator.
How did you like the reading? Reading is it's a different skill than writing. Do you feel
Yeah, I
comfortable with
like
it?
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've done it enough at this point
Yeah.
that I
I
don't get
could.
nervous.
Well, particularly if you're writing shorter form, it just lends it's easier because you can. Although these are longer short forms, so I
There
don't know.
are
Did you
some
try to?
short ones and
Yeah.
some
That.
pretty long ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
I ended up reading a lot of the flash pieces at the events just because it's
Right.
it's nice to be able to read a complete thing,
Yes.
and
Yeah. Very satisfying.
yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, so Lily, what now for you? You've written a full book, you got the collection, you got the piece. Oh, I should mention that you edited a piece called "Burn It Down: Women Writing About Anger." When did that come out? Was that between
uh,
these?
no, that was first actually. That came out in
Oh,
2019.
oh, Oh,
Yeah.
okay. All right.
That came out. I was working on the memoir still while that was happening, but yeah, it ended up coming out first.
Okay. So what's on store? What's up for you now? You've done a bunch of different things. Or do you have a project in mind?
I am, yeah, I'm attempting to teach myself how to write fiction.
Oh my
Yeah. Yeah.
God. Oh Jesus. God, Lily, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. All right. Why
Speaking
not?
of, not wanting to talk about yourself, it's just after like a memoir and then an essay collection of like, I need a break.
So how's that going? What do
I'm
you think?
having a lot of fun.
Are
I mean,
you?
it's hard. There's a lot of stuff that it's kind of, like you said before, going in the other direction. There's a lot of stuff that carries over, right? Like I
Yep.
know how to write a scene. I know how
Yep.
to kind of craft a narrative arc and all that stuff. But there's a lot of stuff also that I'm like, wow, you really do just invent these people out of nothing, don't you?
Hey, they come to you, they tell you who
Yes.
they are.
All right,
But
sure.
you know the thing with fiction is anything can happen. Just any
Yeah,
stupid, I
exactly.
mean, ideally it all fits together. It feels organic,
Right.
but your mind can just say, well, they can go jump on a spaceship if I want them to.
Yeah,
It's
they can
totally
do anything.
all right, you brave woman, you. All right. That's how I feel now about fiction. I feel I'm
Yeah.
so sort of uh, I had such a traumatic
I
experiences
find it
with it.
so freeing and just so much more fun than like digging into all my old wounds. You
All right, well,
know?
good.
Although
Loosen up.
of course, some of my wounds are
Oh, it'll
showing
all
up
come
here
up.
too, of
Yeah.
course. But it's different. It's different when it's
All right. Well, I wish you
a
luck with it.
fraction of it. Thank
I
you.
suspect you're going to do great. I suspect you're going to do
Thank
great.
you.
You're so self-taught. All right. So the book is First Love. Highly recommend it. Highly recommend to people.
Thank
Smart,
you.
funny, feeling. It's got some feeling. She does put feeling in it. A lot of feeling in it. If you
I
like
do. Yeah, I
friendship.
learned how.
Yeah, no, you've done good. You've done good. All right. I'm not quite through with you, young woman. I got
Okay.
one more question. And that's this. I want you to think about all the writing you've done, even that journalism, even your hot takes, all of
Hmm.
it. And if it's taught you anything about life, about being a
Hmm.
person, it's taught you
Hmm.
what?
Hmm. I guess that anything that's worth doing is going to take time and that it's worth allowing yourself to not know what you're doing, and not feeling intimidated by your own um I don't know, need for growth, need for development, and seeing that as opportunity rather than challenge.